award and a lifetime membership in the REA, and then to speak to us. So welcome and congratulations, Bob.
Can't see this, come and have a look later. It's absolutely beautiful and unexpected. Wow! Thank you. Thank you to the REA. Thank you to my lovely friends and colleagues for their lovely words. I vaguely recognise myself somewhere in there, but it was beautiful to hear. I am immensely honoured and feel deeply humbled to accept this award. Thank you very much indeed. I've been in the religion and education business quite a long time now, 45 years. This is my 46th. So I thought that rather than giving you a lecture on the interpretive approach, I'd actually tell you a few stories from my own journey and try to relate them to the conference theme. Partly, of course, the notion of religion in the public sphere, including religion in public education, but also the concept that Ina mentioned of reflexivity. Think of the individual child, or any individual learner of any age, engaging creatively with new knowledge and experience, which is potentially transformative, not only in religion, in anything. That's what education is and should be. Well, I was born into a rather working class family in the middle of England, the county of Derbyshire. The town I grew up in depended on coal mining and iron making. And my family, most of them worked in iron making. And indeed, when I was at university, I had a couple of jobs at the ironworks. All the coal mines have gone, the ironworks is gone. None of it is there anymore, but it really was our world. I went to a post-1945, post-Second World War, experimental school. As David was saying, experiments in education are usually a disaster in England. I think this one was, by its narrowness. I went to what's called a secondary technical school, where the curriculum included English language, not literature, and something called scripture. Thank goodness it did. And it was taught rather well, I might say. And beyond that, the rest of it was science and technology. Absolutely nothing else. So when I got into my teens, I began to get rather frustrated about the narrowness of this. I joined, not in desperation, but I joined the local church youth club. And many good things happened there, including meeting the two clergy who ran the club. One was a social justice person, and he led discussions on social justice. And even better from my point of view, then he took us on long walks in the Derbyshire Hills, raising money for Oxfam and other good causes. That was good. The other guy was deeply into the arts. He introduced us to literature, to poetry, to history, especially the history of the ancient world, which he could just tell like a story, and we would sit at his feet and listen. He also introduced us to the Mediterranean world, to wine, to olive oil, and many other things that have remained rather important in my life. Suffice it to say that I did not follow the path I was being programmed to follow, which was to do a biology degree. I rebelled, and I got a place to do a general arts degree, humanities degree, and you know, I managed to cobble together a first-year course which included Greek language and history. It included Greek philosophy, Plato and Aristotle, and it included biblical studies. And it was a wonderful first year, very hard work, radical change in the way of seeing things, and it was brilliant. And then I carried on doing something called theology. It wasn't really theology, it was biblical studies, church history, some philosophy. And at the end of all of that, I thought, well, I'd quite like to try teaching. So I applied for a teacher training course. Now, by this time, I had become a jazz musician and a jazz singer. And that's another theme here. That is the theme of informal learning. You see, the learning I had from those two clergy in the youth club was not formal learning, but it was hugely important. The learning about jazz was from my peers, from my heroes on record, and self-teaching and experiment. So these have always been there as part of the mix. Anyway, I applied to Cambridge University to do teacher training because I knew there was a really good traditional jazz band there. And I got a place to train to be a specialist religious education teacher. And I went there and I sat in with a local band at a pub, and immediately 6 young guys came up at the end of this and they said, "Do you want to join our band? We're the university traditional jazz band." So I said, "Yes, that's why I came." So I did, and it was great. Then the day of reckoning came. I had to go for 14 weeks into a school in the city of Nottingham to do teaching practice. This was sink or swim, kill or cure, and I went to this highly academic school, the school that D.H. Lawrence went to, actually. Now, the thing about that school, several things. One thing I've never forgotten, I was made tremendously welcome. Many other fellow students were not in the schools they went to. I was made welcome. And they more or less said, "What do you want to do? What would you like to do?" I had a wonderful mentor who was a religious education teacher. I learned so much from him. But then the policy of this school was to have the broadest possible curriculum. Wonderful, at last. I hadn't then discovered Philip Phoenix and his lovely book, Realms of Meaning, which came out just before this time, actually, arguing for a complete liberal education that is not worthy of the name if everything isn't there, including religion. Anyway, the policy was you did your main subject, but you also did other subjects as kind of second string, third string. I was a bit nervous about this. So I could teach biology. I did some biology. And then they said, how about drama? I said, look, I have absolutely no qualifications in drama. And they said, but we've looked at your CV. You're a member of the Cambridge Footlights. Well, if you don't know Cambridge Footlights, it's the review club. So, any of you old enough to remember Monty Python? 2 of the Monty Python team came out of Cambridge Footlights. It's that kind of review club. I was in it as a musician, basically. But they said, look, that's good enough. That's great qualification. That's fine. But they said, we'll put you with people who really do know about drama. And this was magic. I was with these teachers who were so good, and they just nurtured me. And so I had this fabulous experience in this school. I also taught sport. I taught music appreciation, a thinly veiled excuse to play my jazz records to the older students and discuss them. I taught a philosophy course. And at the end of the teaching practice, the head teacher called me in, and I thought, this is the moment when I'm told that I've spread myself too thin. I should have been only teaching religious education. And he said, what are you doing in September? And I said, well, I don't know really. He said, would you be interested in a job here? So I said, I'd be very interested in a job here. How do I apply? He said, you don't, that's the shortest interview you'll ever have. And indeed it was. And so I went back to Cambridge, finished the course, And then a big educational leap happened. I have to say that my interest in jazz started when my then brother-in-law played me a Louis Armstrong record. This was the only time in my life I have experienced conversion. It was totally instantaneous. As soon as I heard a chorus of Louis playing, I knew that that's what I wanted to do, though not playing the trumpet, I might say. Anyway, the band that I was in Cambridge, we went on a tour of the south of France. And we were fortunate enough to be invited to be part of the big marching band opening the great Antibes Jazz Festival in 1967. That was fantastic. But then the most incredible thing happened. Louis Armstrong and the All-Stars only did 2 concerts in France, one in Saint-Tropez. We were hired to do the publicity for the Armstrong All-Stars. We did that, and then we had front seats at Louis' concert in Saint-Tropez. The fact that it was the 28th of July 1967 just happened to stick in my mind somehow. I have a poster of the event on my office wall at home. It's still there now, signed by most of the members of the Armstrong All-Stars. So I met Louis Armstrong, and I met the All-Stars after that. So this was a terrific part of the education. Then back to the school, where I taught for a very happy 5 years. I tell you just one, I could tell you 1,000 anecdotes. I tell you one because it's about the theme. That is, we wanted to make links between the school and local communities. We did it in all sorts of ways: community service, historical visits, and so on. But in religion, we did it by building links with communities. So either we took students out to visit and study communities, to meet people, to interact with them, or we brought them in. And I met one parent, a Muslim, very intelligent guy, very articulate, an engineer, Palestinian. And he was the parent of a 12-year-old. And I said, look, would you come and talk to the 11 to 13-year-olds about Islam? He said, sure, I'll do that. And he came in, and this shows, you see, my lack of experience, having started the job. It shows my lack of experience because he looked very nervous, and he had a very thick sheaf of notes, which he was clearly going to read. So there was time to take him for a coffee, so I did. And I said, look, can you remember when you were 12 years old? He said, yeah, we were in Jaffa. I was there with my brothers. And he said, you know, we really tried to keep the fast, keep Ramadan. And we would start the day and with resolve, and we were going to keep the fast. But the day would get hotter and hotter and hotter. And he said, oh, incidentally, in our garden, it was full of orange trees. And the trees were covered in these beautiful, big, juicy Jaffa oranges. And after so long, our resolve broke, and we climbed the trees and sunk our teeth into the juicy fruit. So I said, do you think you could tell the 11 to 13-year-olds that story? He said, yeah, I'll do that. And he put the notes down. He told them they were absolutely captivated. And of course, we all like to hear about weakness of will. It was a very, very good way into Islam, and the beginning of that. Anyway, had 5 very happy years there. I'm still in touch with the school. I'm still in touch with some of those teachers, some now in their 80s. And I decided I needed to move on. I got very interested in teacher training, partly because of the way in which that school operated. I applied for a job in the city of Coventry, and I got it, and I went there. And this ties in with something I think David said. I moved to Coventry in 1972. I registered immediately to do a philosophy master's at the nearby University of Warwick, which has been my employer since then. for the past 36 years. But I was then a student there, part-time. But my day job took me to the north of the city. And this was the year, 1972, when President Idi Amin expelled all people of South Asian origin from Uganda. You know, it's a long story, I won't go into it. It meant that I was meeting children in school of that background. They introduced me to their parents introduced me to the communities, and thus began another education. This was the most remarkable period, because at first hand I learned about Hindu tradition, Sikhism, Islam, South Asian Christianity, Jainism, etc. It was all there within a few miles. And I got to know many, many families. And I got a call. Well, I have to say, I did start to do some research in my own way. I tried to record interviews, make notes, without knowing that I was doing it. It was at the beginning of starting to learn ethnography. But I got a call from the BBC, from a producer in education who'd heard about this. And he said, look, the BBC has never made any programmes about the religious lives of children from ethnic minorities in Britain. Would you be interested in making some programmes? So I said that I would. Well, this was another education, because they taught me how to make programmes and so on. Actually, doing responsible broadcasting is the same as doing responsible teaching, and it's the same as doing responsible research. All the same processes are involved, all the same moral things, and all the same methodologies, variants on the theme. You know, if you're broadcasting, you've got to interview people. That's a skill. You've got to choose examples that don't distort the broader picture. I mean, for goodness sake, how much broadcasting does distort the bigger picture? But, you know, we tried not to do that. Anyway, it was highly educative for me. We made a lot of programmes. And then I did a seminar at the university. By this time I was working for Warwick University. And a young woman came to this seminar who'd just come back from India, teaching in India. Her name was Eleanor Nesbitt. If you haven't read any of Eleanor's books, you should. She's very remarkable. We ended up working together for the next 25 years or so, and we complemented each other's skills. And in terms of field work, of course, she had access to the sort of women's group, particularly spiritual groups, that I could never have had access to. I had access to very male political groups that she couldn't have had access to. We complemented each other. We wrote a couple of books together, interestingly, one ethnographic text for adults and a text for children. But we got our first research grants, and we were the first group, having added others by then, to get a large grant from the Economic and Social Research, the very first grant given to religious education, one of the very few, from the Economic and Social Research Council. So my own sort of groping in this area gradually turned into quite a sophisticated methodology, because questions were raised by the field itself. For example, Hindu tradition was vibrant. It was full of life and colour. It was full of families. It was full of festivals. It was full of stories. It was not full of long texts. It was not full of philosophy as taught by philosophers. The philosophy was there, but it was conveyed in other ways. There was a discontinuity between Western books on Hinduism, through which I was trying to teach myself about the tradition, and what I was actually seeing on the ground. And that discontinuity had to be explained, which is how I discovered writers like Edward Said on Western constructions of Eastern religions, particularly Islam. But then I found a whole literature on Hindu tradition there, which was most enlightening. I found the work of Wilfred Cantwell Smith which was very enlightening for me as well, because it loosened up the concept of religion, which had been troublesome for me because so much of Hinduism didn't fit into it. Religion just covers every aspect of life, just about, in Hindu tradition. So to have a looser idea where you could look at the individual in relation to the cumulative tradition, that was Smith's idea, was brilliant. And we added the level of groups, because groups are so important within that tradition. Sectarian groups, I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, I mean, you know, having commitment to a guru, that's a sampradaya, the technical term, commitment to a guru and a tradition that you follow. That's one kind of group. There are lots of other kinds of groups as well. So, you know, we were playing with these ideas. I also was incredibly lucky to get a fellowship at London University School of Oriental and African Studies. And I went for the most intensive 3 months to work with absolutely top anthropologists, linguists, and so on, authorities in this field. And I could just ask them any questions I wanted to. Wendy O'Flaherty, incidentally, if any of you know her work in the States, she was at SOAS then. She was a wonderful mentor, so encouraging. And she used to give me almost instant feedback on anything that I wrote, which was brilliant. Having done this, and Ina mentioned the interpretive approach, those key concepts, I would add the concept of representation, how you represent religious traditions to those other concepts, all came out of this. But immediately, you know, Eleanor and I were thinking, well, this isn't just research for us, this has been learning for us. So if it's learning for us, why can't it be learning for children? And we thought, well, surely we can adapt these ideas so children can use them. And we did. And the first thing we did was actually to use the same field data in order to produce material for children, almost in a way that children from a tradition were able to speak to children of their own age outside the tradition through the material of a book. And maybe it wasn't a good decision because it was very labour intensive to do. And of course, if you do books with photographs, the photographs date, oh my goodness, it's got flared trousers, you know, can't be true. They date very quickly. So maybe we should have gone into others, but we did later. We went into in-service training. We had a lot of research students using the interpretive approach in different ways. And then eventually, of course, we went European. And Ina, thank you so much, Ina, and Bert as well, talked about how those ideas have been used in Europe, and particularly used by young researchers who've taken them in directions and ways that I wouldn't even have thought of. Mike Waggoner, who's sitting down here, has recently published a book in a new series on research in religion and education, which is written by former doctoral students of mine, many of whom have been using the interpretive approach in these new and interesting ways that I find really exciting. I could say an awful lot about international work. I'm only going to choose one. I'm not going to talk about Toledo Guiding Principles, and thank you, Bert, for mentioning that. There's a lot to say about that sort of thing. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the Council of Europe, which means a lot to me. I first got involved with the Council of Europe in 2002 and was invited to a meeting in Strasbourg. Now, if you don't know about the Council of Europe, it's not the European Union, even though it's based in Strasbourg. It's much older than the European Union. It dates from 1949. That's when it was set up, the year after the publication of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I find still a most moving document, and particularly the concept of human dignity which underlies it, and especially the context in which it was produced, which was that of desperately not wanting to have totalitarian states in Europe ever again, and to promote liberal, social, democracy in which there could be, amongst other things, freedom of religion or belief. And that's what the Council of Europe stands up for. It has two kind of sides to it. It has a political side. The most powerful committee within the Council of Europe is the Committee of Ministers. That's the 47 foreign ministers of the member states. And it's a powerful group of people. And on the other side, you've got the administration, the directorates, and you've got projects. And the two come together from time to time. Anyway, 2002, the then Secretary General called a meeting. I was at the meeting. He said, look, we do intercultural education. And people say, how can you do intercultural education and never mention religion? And he said, it's embarrassing. We've got to get over it. And he said, I think now the time is to do that. And the wake-up call, the catalyst, the thing that has given a real kick into moving forward is 9/11. You see, 2002, 1 year after 9/11. So the very first project, let me just say, remember where the Council of Europe is. It's in France, it's in Strasbourg, and the concept of laïcité, the idea of total separation of religion and state, which is breaking down in some way, or it's not breaking down, it's changing in France, and it's changing in French education as well. Anyway, the project started in 2002, lots of milestones. We had conferences, a couple of books, but the culmination was 2008, when I was part of a drafting team working for the Committee of Ministers to produce a recommendation to all the 47 member states. And we produced that recommendation, went backwards and forwards to the Committee of Ministers, and they made a change. They decided that as well as dealing with religious diversity, the recommendation should also deal with teaching about non-religious convictions. We hadn't even discussed it, and in the recommendation it isn't even defined. But it's there, it's a recommendation to all 47 governments that they should be trying to think about introducing studies of religion and belief in that human rights sense, non-religious belief, for all students across Europe. Now the recommendation went out. These recommendations are not legally binding. You have to make them work. So the project I'm involved in now is precisely to do that. Bert mentioned the European Vergeland Centre. I had the job of doing a feasibility study for the Council of Europe about setting up a European centre. Should they have a centre for religious education, or should they have a centre that included intercultural, human rights, religious, history, language, not language, but religion and history, and gender, actually, it's cross-cutting themes. And I looked at the options, and I firmly came to the conclusion that a centre for religious education on its own will become completely isolated and will become very vulnerable, and that its place was with these other fields. I argued that, and they set it up because the Norwegian government came forward and offered the money to set it up. So I now work part-time in that centre, and the committee we have, Joint Council of Europe and Vergeland Centre, is to produce a document. It's getting towards, with this in your context, with your particular history, in this case, of religion and state, could you turn it into something that could work for you? So anyway, an international group of us have been working on this. I've been doing the drafting. I've also, we did some research. We contacted all the 47 ministries and got feedback from them. I've been, some of you here have met me at some of these conferences that I've been to get feedback from different parts of Europe. And that itself has been an education for me. The document was going to be called Roadmap, the roadmap, and I didn't like it, because when you look at a roadmap, there is A and there is B, and you go from A to B. I guess you could choose some different routes, but roadmap is too solid. And I was saying this to some students in Finland, and one of them said, no, Finnish first language speaker, she said, how about signposts? I said, brilliant. I said, I think really that is it. So the working title at the moment is signposts. But let me tell you the general contents of this document at the moment, because it would be interesting to see which of these themes come up in this conference. One was the deep discomfort felt in many countries about the ambiguity of terminology. Religious education means half a dozen different things, for example. You know, if you're going to use the term, you need to say what it means. Secularity, spirituality, worldview, lifestyles. You know, these are terms around which there are debates that need to be considered. The question of content was another big issue. The danger is, and the danger spotted by a lot of governments is, if you introduce a lot of religions and worldviews, you can fill the curriculum, the subject, with nothing but knowledge. And it can become inert and alienate people and so on. So, competence, how do you balance knowledge, skills, and attitudes? And how do you get that right balance? It's a contextual thing. So that's another thing we'll be looking at, as well as didactics. Non-religious convictions and worldviews, we'll be discussing that and looking at some of the recent work on that. The idea of the classroom as a safe space, this came up in our REDCO research as well. The idea that young people actually want a forum where they safely and in a civil and civilized way can exchange views and learn from one another. But how do you do that? How do you guarantee it? How do you train teachers for it? That will be something else. Another interesting issue was representation of religions in the media. How can young people be helped to deconstruct the pictures of religions that come through media, often very soon after an event? Human rights issues are there as well, and going right back to the beginning of my story, links to the wider communities. How do schools make those links there? Now, I'm going to finish because I've really been talking in a way that says that teaching is the enabling of learning. You know, that can be done in lots and lots of different ways. It requires, I think creativity is an important word too. I had the privilege of working for about 15 years with Ken Robinson. I don't know whether you know of the work of Ken. He works now for the Gulbenkian Foundation in California, but he's done a huge amount of work on creativity. And I was saying, Ken, this is all a jungle. He said, no, it's not, it's creative. And it was always very useful. But I feel in all this time I have learned a huge amount from the people who are supposed to be learning from me. You know, it's this two-way thing. And now Rosemary and I, we have the privilege of not only having two incredible daughters, but two incredible grandsons. And Sam said, this is the elder grandson, he did say to me, Grandpa, you know everything. I said, no, I don't, Sam. I know very, very little. That's the sort of thing he comes out with. But he said to me, when he wasn't even 4, he was 3 years and 8 months, he said, Grandpa, were you once a boy? And I said, yes, I was, Sam. It was a long time ago now. And he thought for a bit and he said, have you got a picture? And oddly enough, I have very few pictures. I mean, I don't know about other people of my age group. We didn't have cameras even, you know. I think I've got 3 pictures of me as a child. And recently, I put them onto the computer. So we went off to the computer and I put one up. It was a picture of me aged 7. And we went on holiday every year to the same place called Skegness. I actually believed that that's where the sea was in the whole world. In Skegness, he went to Skegness, and that's where the sea was. Anyway, he looked very intently at this picture, and this produced a poem. And I'll finish with this poem. Not yet 4, you view my pick, aged 7. Tin ribs, wide grin, on holiday at Skeg. You peer intently, and now you whisper, did you love me then, Grandpa? Looking on, Wittgenstein falls silent. Brunner and Vygotsky leave to revise their texts. Einstein smiles and goes for a nap. Dawkins R applies for ordination. I couldn't love you then. You weren't yet born, I venture. Null point for repartee. If you had been there, I would have loved you. No better. Nursery zaps PhD. He isn't ready for time, says Piaget, but I wasn't ready for your question.